Hello and welcome to the latest Insurance COVID cast brought to you by Insurance Age and Insurance Post while our journalists are in lockdown. And today we'll be looking at the subjects of concerns over a rise in cyber threats and scams during the coronavirus lockdown. Now I'm delighted to say joining me today I have Andrew Beckett from Kroll, Lindsay Nelson from CFC, Lynn Richmond from BTO, Ralph Sanchez from Beasley, Gareth Wharton from Hiscox, and finally Simon Viney from BAE Systems. Hello everybody.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Hi.
So this is obviously a subject which has been vexing quite a few people. I've been getting quite a few emails about, so we did think it was worth covering. And I'll come to you first of all, Lindsay. Can I just ask simply, how are cyber scammers taking advantage of to target individuals and companies using the COVID-19 as a cover?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think there's quite a few different scams that we're seeing now, where it's not necessarily a rise in the frequency of cyber attacks happening during this time, but more just a change in the methods and the attack vectors that a lot of these cyber criminals are using. And certainly the overarching theme is playing on the concept of human vulnerabilities and human error right now, which has always really been a theme amongst most of the cyber claims that we've seen, but certainly now with the more vulnerable population that are looking for certain types of information about the pandemic, we've certainly seen them be attacked through that new means. You know, the number one source that we've seen at CFC has really been cyber criminals posing as government agencies and more official sources that people are looking to click those links. It is one of the more prevalent tactics that we've seen across the world, not just the UK, and it does play on that human vulnerability factor for an audience that at the moment are willing to open attachments or click links or even provide personal information in order to obtain access to official information about the pandemic. At the beginning, when there were stricter lockdown procedures in place, we saw one particular scam with UK citizens where they were getting fraudulent text messages from people purporting to be the government, notifying them that they had seen them leaving their houses and they must pay a 35 quid fine now to their gov.uk account. So they're ultimately revealing the keys to their bank account details, which is how cybercrime and social engineering fraud tends to be perpetrated. We're also dealing with a case right now where it involves a huge workforce that has migrated to work from home, and the obvious issues that are on everybody's mind right now are remote desktop protocol and whether there's multi-factor authentication in place. And this particular case that we saw has now 4,500 employees sitting at home with encrypted laptops as a result of one clicking a link. So it's driven up the severity of those claims as a result. Frequency is the same, just different methods being used.
Raf, what are you seeing at Beasley?
Yeah, I think there's what Lindsay mentioned is similar probably across many insurers and also incident response firms. COVID is another topical news story that can be used to exploit vulnerable people. People are looking for information, looking for answers, and so more likely than not, they will be clicking on links or offers of information that they might be getting in. I think the fact that they're also in a new scenario, maybe they're working from home for the first time, working with an unfamiliar device, or working and using personal devices for work purposes, there's that blurring of the lines. So I think, as Lindsay says, it is not necessarily a kind of a new attack vector. It's just another topical incident that can be used to exploit people.
Gareth?
Yeah, very much similar lines. So, gov.uk websites being spoofed, a lot of SMS spam around certainly tax rebates around getting money back, or we're starting to see some around the contact tracing app saying you've been seen somewhere close to someone that's got the virus, or those sort of things. There's lots of Android apps around the John Hopkins map that was sort of most famous at the beginning of the outbreak, people spoofing that and installing malware on that. So I think, as Ralph and Lindsay have said, it's preying on people's thirst for knowledge, where I think people are more likely to click on things now than they would have done historically, because there is just that lack of information. I think just people being stuck at home. And another thing that I think is impacting this is that typically when you're in the office, if you get what looks like a phishing email, you've got other colleagues sitting near you, so you can go, did you get that email? Does that look odd? Without having proximity to co-workers, you know, you're going to need to drop someone a note and say, have you seen this? And it's just a bit more effort. So I think there's a higher chance people will click on stuff, or they won't be able to get the reassurance from colleagues.
Simon.
Yes, I mean, you know, from our perspective, we agree with what the others have said. The total volume of attacks hasn't necessarily increased, but almost the sole focus of cybercrime in particular is around using COVID-19 as the sort of the cover, the bait for people. One thing that we have seen, just from our experience in our incident response work, is actually some of the other cyber threats, they haven't gone away. The threats of ransomware, etc., those are still out there. Organizations are still getting, you know, hit by that. Not necessarily using COVID, just because of other weaknesses that those organizations had present that are then being found exploited. So yes, COVID might sort of hit the headlines and dominate, but some of the more traditional threats certainly are still out there. One of the other interesting things actually we saw from some of our work tracking nation-state based threat groups in particular was actually the impact some of those suffered because of COVID. Of course, they went into lockdown as well. And, you know, these are highly professional organizations, they don't work from home. So actually, to some extent, you know, there was a drop in some attacks. That's now generally come back. But there was a drop as well for some of these groups actually being impacted themselves.
Lynn.
Certainly echo what everyone else has said, but I think we're seeing an increased number of our clients who are receiving emails purportedly from existing customers, but with new arrangements for transfer of funds during lockdown, you know, with a view specifically to diverting funds from a known customer to a new account. And I think that's something that's giving quite a lot of people cause for concern. And as Gareth said, I think not having that person next to you in the office to give you a kind of sense check is unsettling for a lot of people. I think something else we're seeing is that, you know, as businesses try to keep operating, they are much less selective about the sort of emails that they respond to. They are much more inclined to follow up things that they might otherwise think they would leave alone. And that obviously gives rise to more opportunities for phishing and scams as well. So I think it's just that kind of willingness to keep doing business, but perhaps not being as selective about who you do business with as they usually would be.
Finally, I'll come to you, Andrew.
I think from a corporate client perspective, one of the big areas we've seen an increase is organizations who don't usually have a work from home workforce are now faced with hundreds, thousands of people working from home, and they've just rolled out whatever VPN technology they had to hand. The end of last year, there was a spate of VPN providers putting out quite large patch updates on their VPNs following the discovery of vulnerabilities. Not everybody has patched those, and we've seen quite a large rise in the exploit of VPN vulnerabilities to gain access to enterprise networks, which are then subsequently exploited. And, you know, again, you know, with organizations rolling out VPN, very few of them have rolled out multi-factor authentication in support of those VPN networks, which again makes life easier for an attacker when they get that access.
Can I ask, Andrew, given that these hackers, these cybercriminals, might sit on the data and information that they get for a matter of months, weeks, months, when do you think we'll see the true implications of the cyber breaches that can be related to COVID-19?
Traditionally, you know, we've seen, you know, 120 days or thereabouts as the average time between the breach occurring and it being discovered. I think the issue and the great unknown here is actually, you know, will the breaches be discovered before they're actually exploited? And that's why people come across it. I think we'll see a lot of organizations when the lockdown is lifted and people go back to work, taking a very serious look and perhaps acting quickly to change their overall infrastructure. I think the way we work going forward will have changed permanently based on the experience under lockdown, with fewer people going into the office, more and more remote working. And I think companies will be doing a lot of infrastructure changes, and that will take away the time of the in-house teams to look at what happened during the lockdown, look at those accesses. And so discovery might actually be delayed further. So I think it's more likely to be they'll discover it when it's exploited, rather than because they spot an attacker in their network.
Gareth?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. Typically we see, when it's a ransomware, that there isn't often a long lag time between initial intrusion and triggering the ransomware, because obviously that's where the payday comes. So typically they lurk for sort of up to 3 weeks to find a high value target. So it's not always a long lead time, but it depends the organisation, the gang, etc., etc. And as Andrew said, with IT teams furiously rolling out a remote access solution or just trying to keep the show on the road, there's less time to be looking at logs or doing the normal instant response work. And certainly talking to some of the claims team that with parts of businesses where there's lots of staff being furloughed, if IT staff are being furloughed or laid off, that capacity that capability isn't in the organisation anymore. So I think we did definitely see a bit of a lull between late March and early April. I think to Simon's point that maybe the remote access for the attackers needed work as well. So, but we did see we've got a claim on the go at the moment with a company that had to rapidly roll out lots of laptops, and what it turned out to be was one of the laptops they rolled out had been in a cupboard for a couple of months, not seen any antivirus updates, not been cleaned recently. They gave it to someone, and as like Lindsay said, it was connected to the remote network and encrypted all the devices on the network. So I think I agree with what everyone else is saying. I wouldn't say the threat has massively increased. There's definitely the theme has changed, but we've seen a couple of new claim types that we wouldn't have envisaged previously. So I think there are changes around the edge, and that remote working does bring some different challenges, not necessarily increased challenges.
Lindsay?
Yeah, I agree with those points as well. I think, in speaking to our cyber claims team in the last couple of weeks, it certainly felt like it might be the calm before the storm in terms of cyber claims activity coming through. If we look at 2019 as the year of the business email compromise, which accounts for a large portion of our UK cyber claims activity, business email compromises being somebody gains access with your credentials into your inbox and lingers there waiting to intercept a funds transfer payment. Those typically aren't discovered until that fund transfer has actually been intercepted and the funds were redirected elsewhere. And even then, some lag time after that, where you get follow-ups from the real person who is supposed to receive that money. So the implications might not be seen for a few weeks or months even. And it's during these times where companies are distracted with other business concerns at the moment, other than cyber, and having a remote or furloughed workforce that make it potentially easier for these criminals to actually get in and be more successful in achieving that access to their inboxes. I think, as well, the initial loss might not be discovered if we're looking at social engineering fraud and fund transfer payments. It's a time where vendors and suppliers aren't necessarily working at the moment either. So those payments aren't going back and forth for supplies that they need because the supplies aren't needed at the moment. So I think when everybody starts getting back to business and it's more normal time, so to speak, I think that's when we're going to start to see the real fruition of claims that happened during this time.
Raf?
Yeah, I think Lindsay's probably hit the nail on the head. It's when people go back to business as usual. I think people are not in business as usual, as Andrew said, in terms of rolling out a new VPN solution. We actually had an insured on renewal who was suggesting to the underwriters that they were going to re-image personal laptops with the organization's preferred build, secure build, which is a huge amount of work for a remote workforce, who would have to be supported over the telephone. So as with Andrew, what I am worried about is, those teams that ordinarily would have, one eye or more looking at a SOC, looking at audit logs, looking at a SIEM, they are now being repurposed for other tasks. And so that's the query, is whether, there are active exploits that have not been noticed.
Simon?
Yes, I think the timescale is variable. There will be some which are the immediate cybercrime hit, particularly some of the ransomware ones where once they they make sure they've got the access, they make sure they've they can effectively take the organisation down. That's their moment when they know they need to strike. There's others though that are almost a bit more espionage type focused. They might be just seeking to get longer term access to an organisation, looking just to steal trade secrets or whatever it may be. And actually, as Lindsay mentioned, they might just be, they get the access and they will sit on it until they get the right payment diversion opportunity. They could do it now, but it might be a low value payment. There's less benefit in them for that. They wait for, the moment where they can actually really, get the most value. So there's certainly a bit of I think, a wait and see going on in terms of that, really.
Yeah. Finally, I'll come to you, Lynn.
Yeah, I think in terms of implications, it could be several months. I mean, as people return to the office and return to some sort of normality, certainly the risk, I think, will begin to dissipate. But as the others have said, that initial focus when people return to the office will be getting back up and running, and it could be some time before any issues are discovered. In terms of implications, as Simon was saying, it will no doubt depend on the type and the quality of data that's been harvested. Is it something that they will get an immediate payback from, or is it something that will give them an in to get further information in the future? And particularly, if that leads to a bigger payday, you may see people sitting on it and waiting for the right time to use it. So it could potentially be months and perhaps even years.
Can I ask you, Lynn, I mean, what advice have you been giving to businesses that things they can do in order to reduce staff vulnerability to these cyber attacks whilst working remotely, particularly because, as everyone keeps saying, this is likely now to become more of a new normal, i.e. people working more from home?
Sure. I mean, I think information is key, and that's what we've been trying to get across to our clients and also to our own staff, to keep in touch with people. To remind people about the policies and procedures that you have in place. So a lot of organisations have very good systems in place, and they're very easy to follow when you're in the office and when you're working normally. But a lot of people tend then to forget about that, and it's not a top priority when you're working in circumstances like these. So I think it's keep in touch with your staff, remind them about what normal practice is. And a lot of it, for us, tends to be a very common sense approach. If a member of staff receives an email for information, if there's a sense of urgency about it, have a think about why that is the case. Is there a genuine urgency to it? Do just apply some common sense. And of course, technical issues relating to home working are very important. Some of the others have touched on using personal devices, making sure that they have the appropriate security applied. And just in terms of keeping up to date with training, that's also very important. Make sure your staff know what the current risks are, and if there's any particular vulnerabilities that they might have in the present circumstances.
Simon?
Yes, I mean, making information available to staff is important, and making it effectively a curated set of information. You want to make sure that, particularly in circumstances people find themselves in now, staff aren't going off and doing their own research and thinking, yes, this is the right way to do something. You need to make it easy for them to find the right information. That said, though, education and awareness and training won't ever solve this by itself. It's an important thing to do, but it won't ever completely solve this. So we have to get to the situation where, from an IT perspective, one user getting tricked into clicking on something won't result in a full compromise directly of that organisation. We have to move away from that. There's a whole set of measures linked to that around multi-factor authentication, reducing use of administrator privileges in organisations, not sharing passwords across different systems, etc., particularly on the administration side. And effectively moving away from that flat network concept that a lot of organisations have built up, where everything could talk to everything. You don't actually generally need that anymore, and technology has progressed to allow you to move away from that. So really, it's that's probably more important than actually the user and staff awareness point.
Lindsay?
Yeah, agree with all of those points again. I think the overall theme that we would say is just preparedness, and being prepared and proactive is much better for a business in terms of the severity of and the outcome of the event rather than reacting to it on the spot. Preparedness is definitely an overall umbrella term for a number of things, of which employee training is one of them, which Lynn mentioned. But for simplicity's sake, if I could cascade one message from our cyber claims team into your point just made right now, multi-factor authentication would by and large be the number one thing that we'd request that all businesses get as a measure of protecting their own vulnerabilities and exposures. If we look back on our 2019 cyber claims statistics from last year, 80% of our cyber claims actually happened through remote desktop protocol, of which can be avoided, those incidents, through implementing multi-factor authentication. So certainly we'd advocate for that. And then, of course, I will say when all else fails, cyber insurance is there to help mitigate those exposures.
Andrew.
Yeah, I agree. The way you reduce the vulnerability is twofold. It's you've got those controls centered around the staff members, be that education, security of the device that they're using for remote access, and password reuse, and then you've got the organizational processes in place about securing the VPN access, reducing the number of protocols that can be used through that remote access, preventing the use of elevated levels of privilege on devices, and putting in place monitoring services that monitor the activity so spot that attack, spot that intrusion as early as possible, so you can react faster, minimize the damage that occurs when an attacker does gain access.
Gareth?
Yeah, I think the point here is, as everybody said, is, if you're a well-prepared company, this is just a different type of threat. So like Lindsay said, preparing for an event, making sure, you've got a good DR and instant response plans. The key things, like Lindsay was saying, from our claims, when we look at last year's claims, the two games in town are business email compromise and ransomware largely. If you've got offline backups and multi-factor access for remote staff, that's going to knock out the multitude of these things. And as everybody's been saying, we're not seeing new attack methods. We're largely seeing new themes on existing types of attacks. So as long as you've got that protection in depth, you should largely be okay. I think it is worth making the point, though, that we built disaster recovery plans and business continuity plans for events that weren't like this pandemic. So I don't have, if we invoked DR, can I get to that offsite? Can I? My instant response firms, are they working? Can they get to the places they need to do the work? So I think it's worth dusting off the plan and going, would it still work in a pandemic situation?
Finally, Raf.
I think the themes that everyone's raised, MFA, flat networks, education, they are the same themes that we've been discussing for the last 2 years. I think all senior stakeholders should be made to watch over an 8-year-old's participation in a Zoom remote lesson. I have seen my son evade MFA, basically take over one of his lessons, mute his teacher. The dangers of flat networks, Simon, 8-year-olds should not be allowed to talk to each other, and neither should, printers and various devices on the network. So I think the more you can, though, involve, as Lynn said, hopefully using common sense, ordinary users, and make them understand that there is no silver bullet, there is no perfect solution out there without them understanding what their obligations are as users of company data, of company resources. But in the background, you do need those controls to prevent them, if they are duped, into basically taking very prejudicial actions.
Can I ask, Raf, do you think there'll be any implications in terms of the take-up of cyber insurance post-COVID-19?
I was trying to think what my thoughts were on that. We've definitely seen increased requests from underwriters for talking points around why cyber insurance is a good solution for COVID risk or any other type of cyber risk. The usual talking points are the same. It's a combination of risk transfer with risk mitigation. I think the challenge we have now is we're entering a pretty dire macroeconomic environment, and with lots of demands on budget and on no doubt smaller budgets, that's going to be the challenge, is getting across the value of cyber insurance to people who could equally be spending it on fancy pieces of software or monitoring solutions.
Yeah, Gareth.
Yeah, I think talking to a few of our underwriters, I think like Raf was saying, we're seeing a couple of things, especially from the bigger customers with already rate increases in other P&C lines. That sort of spend on insurance has been stretched already, and with the pandemic, cash flow is king at the moment. So people are keeping their wallets closed if at all possible. So I think in some sectors we'll see stress on the cyber market. Although talking to the UK underwriters in the smaller and middle market space, there seems to be more customers saying, okay, I understand why this is a risk now. I need to make sure I protect it. And something that we've always thought is it's for companies that don't have a big online presence, but still use a lot of data in their day-to-day business. They don't really necessarily understand the value of their data, so it's been invisible. But I think working at home is making that visible, the invisible visible. So there's a view that that's critical to me now. I should be protecting it. So I think I can see both sides of it, but it maybe depends on size of business.
Lindsay?
Yeah, certainly agree with it potentially being an industry-specific issue as well. From our perspective, our hope would be that people do recognize their exposures in this time, but equally, we want to make sure that cyber isn't framed as a COVID-19 issue, so to speak, because those claims were increasing by frequency and severity long before this happened as well. But what it has done is bring to light that there are technological challenges with migrating to a remote workforce. There's new exposures, there's new talking points for businesses. But once this is all over, and it will be over eventually, it certainly doesn't feel like it at the moment, but when it is, we want to make sure that businesses are along the same lines of thinking, that they still have that exact same exposure, even when they're back to the office then. So, right now, only 10% of UK businesses we see are actually purchasing a cyber policy to begin with. So the challenge has always been on the cyber insurers and cyber brokers as well to help educate clients and help them understand the value of the policy, what their exposures are specific to them, without making comparisons to some of the large, FTSE or Fortune 500 companies in the news, and really tailoring that product to them. So TBD, to be determined in the next few months.
Andrew?
I agree with what's been said. I think for many companies, the issue is going to be price and the competing requests on what is going to be limited cash flow as companies come out of COVID. But offset with this recognition that data is critical, and a better awareness of what data they actually need and what has supported them through this process. I think in terms of implications for take-up of cyber insurance, it'll also be interesting to see how many carriers are imposing conditions along with cyber insurance, and potentially asking for defined levels of protection amongst their insureds before they will write a policy. Because I think we will see a rash of claims for those who have existing cover. And people understand how many breaches have happened and what type of breach post-COVID. Will that change how the products are marketed and any conditions? I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised to see to see conditions put on cyber insurance going forward.
Lynn?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with all that. I think it will definitely depend on business size and sector as well. I think a lot of businesses, one of their first thoughts now will be business interruption insurance. We've seen a lot in the news about that recently. For cyber policies, it'll probably very much depend on cash flow. And as Andrew was saying, it will be interesting to see what conditions are imposed as a sort of benchmark for the systems that need to be in place before that policy will be offered. And again, that might preclude some smaller businesses from taking that up.
And finally, I'll come to you, Simon.
Yes, so as some of the others have said, the focus on cybercrime in the news, I can certainly see, driving some interest in cyber insurance. I think the key thing, though, really just from actually our perspective, is for organisations just to make sure they understand what they're getting from the cover they're buying. you know, you take the same trouble with your home insurance policy or whatever. For an organisation, it's just making sure they get the right people involved in actually having that understanding. So they bring the right, you know, the organisation seeking the insurance brings the right people to the table in the first place.
Okay, well, on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much to my panelists, Lindsay, Simon, Gareth, Andrew, Raf, and Lynn. Thank you very much all.
Thank you.
This is part of an ongoing series, Insurance COVID Cast, which is brought to you by Insurance Age and Insurance Post. If you'd like to register or subscribe to either title, then please use the tab in the banner, which is up here. But until the next COVID Cast, all I have to say is goodbye and stay safe, everybody. Cheerio.